Rules. Who likes rules?
Police, judges, lawyers.
But we're music people types, rebels. The rules don't apply to us, or do they? Are there really rules in music production and mixing, and you just don't know them? Or even worse, you do know some of the rules and they're just holding you back from getting a better mix or producing better music? So we'll examine a few of these unwritten rules in mixing and music production and see which ones you could break, which ones you could bend to your will, and which ones you just really can't touch. Coming up. Hey, what's up? Artie here from the Skylab Music Group, bringing you the best pro tips and advice for music producers, artists, engineers, and singers to help you propel your music and your career up to the next level. On this channel, we do a lot of tips and strategy videos as well as tech reviews, so if you're new here, please subscribe and ring the bell so you won't miss out on any new content. All right, so let's get into the video. Back when I was in attendance in engineering school, at the coveted Institute of Audio Research.
Cut that out! Cut that out!
I remember being warned about the nasty phase problems that can utterly destroy your mix if you went too far with equalization. I was warned never to print with effects on. I was severely warned about slamming meters into the red for fear of distortion. I was lectured repeatedly on the tolerances of gear and the optimal range levels each piece operates at with the lowest distortion and noise. And because I didn't fully understand why at the time, the fear of ruining my mixes gave me a very soft touch, like using a dash of salt or just a sprinkle of pepper. Well, how does that work if you're cooking hot and spicy Cajun food, or Mexican, or Indian, or Thai, or... You get my point. It doesn't work. And a light, subtle touch while mixing music doesn't always work either, especially not these days. But I remember assisting on my first big mix. I remember my shock when I assisted on my first big mix session and saw the engineer twisting knobs to boost levels by 15 dB, adding distortion, making the faders do these crazy things, rocking the reels backwards and forwards.
What about the wicked evil phase police?
He was slamming levels into the red, having me make these crazy, insane patches that had my sense of reality spinning out of control. But what was this madness I saw before me? Behold, by morning, the insanity and terror of that dark night had simply vanished, and what was left in its wake was a divine and heavenly mix, radiating such depth and beauty that it was worthy of the angels. But it wasn't the engineer's utter disregard for the rules of sound that made him such a great engineer, but rather the opposite, in fact. He was coming from a place where he had a total knowledge of sound, understanding the components he was using and what their limitations were. He not only knew what he wanted, but he knew how to bend and twist and distort and manipulate the sound in order to get there. And he also knew where and when to hold back. But what really impressed me was his understanding of how a piece of equipment would react when pushed way beyond the optimal conditions it was designed for. And that, in my eyes, was breaking the rules to achieve a better mix. Let's look at the first unwritten rule. Beware phase problems if you use too much EQ. This myth has been around for decades, but what does it even mean? The very nature of equalization, either analog or digital, is that it shifts the phase. That's how it works. I'm not going to go into all the boring or fascinating technical details here, but if this myth is holding you back from cranking that 8 kilohertz up another 15 dB, ignore it. It took a while for me to finally unlearn this, but my mixing was so much better once I did. Ethan Weiner wrote a great technical article totally debunking this phase problem myth, and we'll put a link in the description below if you want to check it out. The next rule we'll examine is never print with effects on. Well, this on the surface does make sense, and if you're somewhat inexperienced, this is a good practice to follow early on. And generally speaking, you don't want to lock yourself into a sound that you might want to change during the mix. You can't ungate a clipped tom fill or undistort a guitar or bass, but the problem is sometimes you need to get a specific sound while you're recording, and the effects might be part of that sound. Let's say you're recording a live drum kit and you want a certain nasty sound that you're just not going to be able to quite get during the mix. Well, to get that sound, when recording, maybe you have to overload the preamps a bit and then squash the signal with a specific analog compressor. Yes, you're committing to that specific overloaded sound because you won't be able to totally clean up the drums in the mix if you decide later on you want a clean, pristine sound. But don't be scared. Find the right sound for the song and just commit. It's good to limit your options as you proceed through production because it'll keep you focused. Well, let's say you're recording a guitar and the guitarist already has his sound set up with all his pedals. Well, that's his sound, so just capture it, effects and all. So we can bend that rule a bit. But when recording a vocal track, I would really advise to print only with minimal effects, maybe just a little EQ and compression. A raw, clean vocal signal will give you the flexibility to do a wide variety of processing in the mixdown, and you can fine-tune until it sits perfectly in the track. Although sometimes when doing remixes, the acapella vocal we get already has all the effects on it, so we make do. But if I do end up with an audio instrument, a sample, or a vocal track that has too much reverb, or even if a vocal was recorded in too large a room and I want to reduce that ambience, I use this great little plugin by Plugin Alliance called Deverb Plus. It really works wonders and allows me to dial back the reverb. We'll put a link down below. So basically, don't be scared about printing with effects, but just be smart about it. Okay, this next one we all know and love. Keep the signal out of the red. Let's divide this into two camps, analog mono plugins and what this means in the digital world. First, let's get this out of the way. Printing your final mix past 0 dB in the digital world is an absolute no. The number one rule not to bend or break. It'll distort your final mix in an unpleasing way and be unusable on iTunes, Spotify, and other sites. So that's actually a hard and fast rule, and maybe the only one, so don't break it. So what about slamming individual channels into the red on a digital audio workstation like Pro Tools, FL, or Logic? Well, generally speaking, going over 0 in the digital world means that you've exceeded the amount of available bits, and it will result in the clipping of the peaks and the transients, and even more. If the peaks are short, let's say 4 milliseconds or less, it should be unnoticeable. But if they're repetitive and sustained, you'll hear it, and it might not be very pretty. Samples that exceed the peak quantization level are simply truncated, clipping the waveform squarely, which gives you distortion in the form of large quantities of higher frequency harmonics. So I find it better not to go past 0 on individual channels. But that said, occasionally I still do. And when I do, I listen very, very closely. And if I still like what I hear, I go with it. But what about slamming things into the red on analog plugins? Why is that so different? Well, these plugins were meant to emulate their analog counterparts, so we have to be aware of what happens to analog circuits when they're overloaded. Let's look at tape machine simulators and saturation. I won't go into the full technical details here, but I think it's important to understand what happens so you can have better control over it. Basically, tape saturation occurs when the incoming audio signal exceeds the point where the tape's magnetic particles can accurately track the converted voltage swings. And this results in a gradual clipping of the positive and negative peaks of the wave that's being imprinted on the tape. So this is where we get a slight compression and a little harmonic distortion, which helps glue everything together. And that's what we call saturation. And in many cases, it sounds really good. But what if you really push the levels deep into the red on a tape machine or a tape simulator? You'll hear this clipping, this distortion, which is quite different from the distortion you'll hear from overloading a preamp or using a bit crusher. But we're told not to print into the red. But this is one rule we can bend a bit and tailor to our needs when emulating printing to tape. Try that more extreme tape saturation on a drum bus or a bass. By adjusting tape speed, bias, the type of tape, and the alignment, you could really control the level of the distortion and the frequencies that are breaking up, actually even tuning your harmonic distortion a bit. So when you want to add a little more grit to your tracks, tape saturation might really do the trick. So what about overloading a preamp modeling plugin or the inputs on an analog channel strip plugin? I found this really depends on the manufacturer and the specific channel strip. When operating within a normal range of conditions, most channel strips do a pretty good job of emulating their analog granddads. But when pushed to an extreme, they don't react the same way unless they were specifically designed to. When I first heard the Scheps 73, modeled after the Neve 1073 by master engineer Andrew Scheps for Waves, I was really blown away. Andrew really went out of his way to make sure that the overloaded preamp sound sounded like the original analog piece, which has its own unique quality of distortion, in addition to emulating all the other parameters very closely. So my advice is trust your ears on this one, and don't be afraid to push things into the red. But before you go off and wildly start twisting knobs, metaphorically speaking, of course, just take a moment and ask yourself, what's really the sound you're trying to achieve here with this specific track? And then just go for it. There really aren't any hard and fast rules.
Never exceed 0 dB on your master.
But there are best practices and guidelines which you should know. This way you can be smart about it when you want to color outside the lines. Okay, so thanks for tuning in. I hope you learned a few things here and maybe unlearned a few as well. Are there any rules that you know about that I left out? If there are, please let us know because I'd love to hear as well as everyone else. So please share your thoughts and any questions in the comments below. And we have links down below to all the plugins mentioned, as well as some technical articles that go into more depth about what we covered today. So thanks for checking out this video, and for more music production and mixing videos like this, please subscribe below. And if you liked it, please take a moment and give us a thumbs up. Thanks, you're the best. Until next time, Skylab Music is bringing you the best pro tips and tools for growing your music career. So play it louder, and we'll talk soon. Indeed, there are certain irrefutable laws of physics as it applies to sound that we should at least be aware of if our business is manipulating sound as musicians, music producers, and engineers. I mean, don't we want to bend sound to our will?